This is Chapter 7, Nutrients Involved in Fluid and Electrolyte Balance. So to begin with, as we talk about fluids, let's talk about what fluids are. So by definition, fluids are substances that are composed of freely moving molecules. So these can have the ability to conform to the shape of the container. When we look at the body, because we're really focusing on bodies here, for the most part we're going to be talking about things that are liquid in nature, things like water. Those are going to be the fluids that we see within our body. Now in terms of the fluids, there are different kinds of fluids that we might find in the body. We have about 2/3, somewhere between 50 and 70%, about 2/3 of the body fluid is held within our cells and is called intracellular fluid. When we talk about intracellular fluid, this is fluid that we find within our cells. The other 1/3 is referred to as extracellular fluid, and that extracellular fluid is outside of the cells. So if we take a look here, here's an example of a cell. This would be our intracellular fluid, and then the extracellular fluid. In terms of the extracellular fluid can actually be lumped into two main groups. One is called the tissue fluid. Tissue fluid, also called interstitial fluid, is what you would find in your tissues, in between the spaces between cells, making up particular organs. Some of the other types of extracellular tissue fluids would be things like cerebrospinal fluid and mucus, and also synovial fluid, which you'd find within your joints. The other kind of extracellular fluid is called intravascular fluid, and that's fluid that's found specifically within blood vessels and lymphatic vessels. So here we have extracellular fluid that's inside these vessels, and then we have, of course, the tissue fluid that is the extracellular fluid. Inside themselves, the cells themselves, you would have the intracellular fluid. Now when we talk about blood is made of several different things. One of the components of blood, and we'll talk about this in a later chapter, is plasma, and that is the fluid portion of the blood. So let's just clear that up early on. Now how much fluid we have within a particular tissue varies highly dependent upon the type of tissue. So lean tissues, these would be tissues like muscle tissue, actually have a higher fluid content than fat tissues. That has to do with the fact that fat tissues are made of lipids, and lipids tend to repel water or be repelled by water. Another big difference has to do with, in terms of individuals, gender and age. So depending on gender and age, we may see differences in the amount of lean tissue, and then based upon that, more body fluid. Right? With age, we tend to see a loss of lean tissue, and therefore a loss of body fluid. Now when we talk about body fluid, we're not talking about pure water here. Water is a big component. Right? Please remember that water, in terms of its molecular form, is 2 hydrogens bound to 1 oxygen, H2O, but pure water is not what we have in the body. What we have in the body is actually a mix of water with things dissolved in it. One of those big things that we're going to talk about today are what are called electrolytes. So electrolytes are mineral salts that are dissolved in water. The 4 main ones we'll talk about in this chapter are sodium, potassium, chloride, and phosphorus. Now when we say mineral salts, you see the word salt here, and you might think about table salt. And table salt is an example of a mineral salt. Table salt is actually sodium chloride, and that table salt is going to, when you consume table salt, you wind up getting sodium ion and chloride ion, and those ions dissolve in the water. Now please take a few minutes and check out the animations on either mastering or also posted in Blackboard. So if we take a look at these electrolytes have charge to them. Right? So they're able to carry electrical charges. So here is our sodium ion. Sodium is written as Na. And then we have potassium. Potassium is written as K. So this is sodium plus potassium plus. Those are the ions, and these have a positive charge. Here we have the chloride ion with that negative, and then phosphorus. Phosphorus usually doesn't exist by itself. It's actually in a group called the phosphate group, which is written over here. So if you see NaCl together, that is your table salt. When mixed in water, these ions separate, giving us sodium and chloride separately. In the intracellular fluid, so the fluid that's within the cells, the phosphate and potassium ions tend to be the predominant electrolytes, whereas in the extracellular fluid, the sodium and the chloride ion tend to predominate. What that leads to the possibility of there being different electrical charges, and we're going to see these electrical charges that are created by this difference in charge across the plasma membrane of a cell is going to be very important, especially in how our neurons function and how our muscles function. All right, so we're going to talk about electrolytes and electrolyte balances and imbalances. We'll often relate those back to things having to do with the nervous system and also with the muscle system. So let's just talk a little bit about fluids and some of the things that our body fluids can do. Water is an excellent solvent. Now, the term solvent means that other things can be dissolved into it. So many things can be dissolved. Anything that is said to be water soluble can be dissolved in water. Obviously, things that are water insoluble, or what would be called lipid soluble, are not able to dissolve in water, and we'll talk about a few of those separately. Some of the things that can easily be dissolved, those solutes, would be things like ions, right? Some carbohydrates, amino acids, and different vitamins and minerals. So all of these may be dissolved into the fluids. Once they are dissolved in the body fluids, they can be transported. Another important job that fluids do has to do with creating blood volume. Our circulatory system, our blood system, is a closed system in the sense of, depending on how much blood we have in the system, is going to have an effect on the pressure within the system. Right? So the blood volume is the total amount of fluid within the blood. If we have the normal amount, that is going to be our normal blood pressure. If there is an increase in blood volume, it may lead to an increase in blood pressure, which is called hypertension. And we can see that there are many different causes for hypertension. On the same thought process, then, if we have a decrease in blood volume, we may see low blood pressure, which is actually just as problematic in some ways as high blood pressure can be. Very important job of fluids has to do with maintaining body temperature. A good portion of the adult's body is made of these fluids, specifically water, and water has a very high heat capacity. What that means is it takes a good deal of energy, heat energy, to actually make water change temperature. That helps to, even in hot environments, our bodies can withstand changes in temperature. A second thing in terms of cooling is especially our blood, the fluid in our body, acts as a coolant. The same way in a car, there is a coolant that passes around the engine to pull heat away from the engine and prevent it from overheating. We have the same thing. So as our blood passes through our organs, pulls excess heat away, takes that to the surface, that surface then can allow the heat to dissipate. In addition, we also use fluids in terms of sweat. And sweating is important because as we sweat, that fluid leaves our body, it lands on our skin, and as it evaporates into the environment, that evaporation leads to a cooling feeling and helps to keep us cool. So overall, fluids in the body act as coolants. So if we take a look at this diagram here, this is just a diagram of the skin. These are the different layers of the skin. Right? When we have heat produced in our core, that can travel. Right? So when you are outside and exercising on a warm day, you get flushed, right? Where you get red in the face and the cheeks and some of the limbs. What that is more blood moving away from the core to the limbs, to the extremities, to pull that heat away. On the opposite side, this can also be used in reverse to maintain heat. Right? So if it was very cold out, you might feel like your lips start to turn blue or your fingers start to turn blue. That's the blood staying near the core to keep that heat circulating around the core. Right? Very important in terms of maintaining body temperature. Another important function is lubrication. We have many areas. A large one that you probably have thought of before has to do with synovial fluid. Synovial fluid is found within our freely movable joints or synovial joints. Digestive secretions allow for easy passage of material. Things like saliva. If you've ever tried to eat something when you have a very dry mouth, it becomes harder to swallow. We use saliva mostly to break food up, not chemically, but to moisten it so that it can pass through. We also use this as protection in terms of shock absorbers. So when we have a developing fetus and a pregnant female, that fetus is surrounded with amniotic fluid, and that acts as a shock absorber. Also, we have surrounding our very delicate brain and spinal cord something called cerebrospinal fluid. And that cerebrospinal fluid, when we move our head back and forth rapidly, helps to allow our brain to be cushioned and not slam up against the side of our skull. Now, within these fluids, what exactly are the electrolytes doing? So one of the important jobs of the electrolytes within the fluids is the electrolytes actually help to regulate fluid balance. And this has to do with the movement of water called osmosis. And this is going to have a huge impact on the way water moves into and out of our cells, and the overall effect of how fluids affect our body. So let's just quickly review a little bit about osmosis. Your book actually gives a very nice description of this. Our cells are covered with a plasma membrane, and that plasma membrane is said to be permeable to water. There are little channels within that plasma membrane that allows water to go back and forth. So what determines the way water moves? Water moves based upon the concentration of solutes, right? The things that are dissolved in the fluids. So if we imagine, for example, we have a glass here, and then this divider is similar in its structure to any of the plasma membranes. So water can pass through it, but the solutes cannot. So now we have this equally filled cup of pure water. If we add some salt, salt, table salt, sodium chloride, what happens, we are now adding solute to this side. Now the solute can't pass through, but what we see happening is osmosis. Osmosis would be the movement of the water, the molecules of water from this side, that's still pure water, over towards the side that has the solute. And what would actually occur is you would see a change in the volume of water on one side of the membrane or the other. Now, if we think about what would happen in a cell, if this occurs within a cell, if you have some amount of solute in the fluid, the intracellular fluid, and some amount of solute in the extracellular fluid, if those two concentrations of solute are the same, you get a little bit of movement of water in and a little bit of movement of water out, and overall you get no net movement. Right? So the cell maintains its shape. However, if we have a much higher concentration of solute inside of the cell, in the intracellular fluid, and a much lower concentration of solute outside in the extracellular, what will happen is water will move by osmosis in. Imagine what's going on here is that the water is moving to try and dilute this. Right? So as the water moves in to the cell's membrane is a fixed volume. Right, so we're now shoving water into it, That's eventually going to cause these cells to swell and maybe burst. Right? When we talk about bursting, that is called lysis. Now, on the opposite side, if we have a cell and that cell has a very low solute concentration relative to the extracellular environment, right, there is a lower concentration of solute here, the water is going to move by osmosis towards the higher solute concentration. It's going to move out, and this cell is going to shrink. That is a process known as crenation. So these are very important. Having the proper balance, having the proper concentration of electrolytes are very important to the physical health of the cell. Both of these instances here and here could actually result in the death of the cells from either exploding or shrinking. Another important function of electrolytes has to do with how our nerves function. Right? The cells that make up our nervous system are called neurons. And the way they function has to do with movement of charged particles across their plasma membrane. And that electrical charge creates things called potentials, or action potentials, and that's what allow our neurons to work. In a very simple sense, the way that a neuron can function is when we have these differential or these different concentrations of charges across the plasma membrane, and then there's a change, and that movement, so now we see this right here we're seeing these red pluses, or the sodium electrolyte or the sodium ion, are going to move in, and that's what creates our electrical signal. So the functioning of the neurons is actually due to movement of things, especially the sodium and potassium ions. Now, without getting too much into the nervous system or getting into how neurons function, if we do not have the proper balance of sodium and potassium especially, then we don't see the proper functioning of our neurons. And when we go through and talk about some of the imbalances that can occur, oftentimes things like seizures or convulsions will occur. Very similar, electrolytes are also important in signaling our muscles how to contract. This has to do more with calcium. Calcium is very important, but what actually triggers the calcium movement is a neuron, usually, that is responding to sodium and potassium movements. Right? Now, we're not going to go in depth into calcium here. Calcium is important in terms of an electrolyte in muscle cell, but calcium is much more important when we talk about bone health, and so we'll discuss that in depth in a later chapter. So having the proper fluid balance is quite important, and by fluid balance it's not just the water balance, right? It's also the balance of electrolytes. So fluid balance is how much fluid do we have and how much electrolyte do we have, right? So the first part of that is getting the fluid in, getting the water portion of the fluid in, and for the most part we get that through drinking and eating. Now, we have something called a thirst mechanism. The thirst mechanism is part of our brain, and what we have is from part of the forebrain called the hypothalamus. You might remember the hypothalamus is important in hunger. We also have a thirst sensor. Now, the problem is, once an individual becomes thirsty, usually there is a much lower amount of fluid present. Right? So the recommendations are to drink before you actually become thirsty. Okay. One of the ways that we lose water is when we go through our daily lives. We lose water in a few ways. There are some things that are called sensible water loss in the sense of we can sense them. So these would be things that we are aware of, things like water loss through urine output, through sweating. Right? So we all know when we're sweating. We all know when we're urinating. Right? We do also lose water through what are called the insensible water loss, which is things we're not usually aware of. And this can be just from exhaling. Right? When you exhale, the air that is released actually is moist. It has some amount of fluid water within it. We also lose some amount of water with feces, and you're usually not that aware of this. There is still some amount, even though our the food that we digest sits in the colon and most of the water is reabsorbed. Right? So we get our water back in through the foods we eat, from the beverages we drink, and also from some metabolic reactions. And metabolic water is water that basically gets recycled through the body and pulled out of other reactions. When we are building things like building proteins in the previous chapter, we did dehydration synthesis, where you put two amino acids together by pulling out a water molecule. That's where we get metabolic water from. When we look at the loss of water, most of our water is lost through urine. This is going to be controlled by the kidneys. Now, we can actually change that by taking things that are called diuretics. And diuretics increase fluid loss via urine, so they actually increase urine output. Now, diuretics are often used to treat certain water or fluid imbalances. We are going to look at some foods that have high water content, and of course we have the water that we take in through drinking beverages, liquids, which includes both water and then additional beverages as well. Right? So please make sure you check out the water balance animation on Blackboard or in Mastering Nutrition. Right. So let's just take a few minutes and look at the water content of some foods. You'd be surprised at what the water content is of certain foods. So things like iceberg lettuce. Iceberg lettuce is almost all water. Same thing with things like cucumbers. A very high percentage of water, as opposed to things like almonds, right, which have a very low amount of water in them. So depending on what you're eating, you actually can get some amount of water from just consuming food. Now, we need water for life, so not only for the fluid and electrolyte balance, but for many other metabolic functions, we need to have water. In terms of intake, we have to think about the activity level of individuals, the size of individuals, age, gender. There's a lot that varies. Also, here we see a very important role of environment. The reason for that is if you have someone who lives in a very dry environment, they're most likely losing more water in those insensible ways, so in terms of exhalation. So all of those things come into play when we think about recommended intake. Now, there are questions in terms of what happens if you take in too much or too little water. For the most part, drinking too much water, you really need to drink an extreme amount of water to drink too much water. It can happen. Usually the reason it becomes problematic is because it leads to a dilution of sodium in the body, which is called hyponatremia, and we'll discuss that a bit more in depth when we talk about the importance of sodium. What's much more common is not drinking enough water, and we call that dehydration. Dehydration can occur quite rapidly, especially in some of our special groups, like our infants and the elderly. And when you don't drink enough water, all sorts of problems can occur, very mild things, including some types of gastrointestinal impacts, but eventually dehydration can be serious enough to lead to death. Right? Now, how much water someone should take in and put out, depending on, and if we talk about an average female with a daily expenditure of approximately 2,500 kilocalories per day, which we would consider average for an active female. This is the amount of water that you might be able to imagine. This is 2,200 milliliters. If we convert that into the imperial form, or cups, all right, a little over 9 cups of water. Taking in some in food sources as well, and then those that are produced within the body in terms of metabolic water. And we should have the same amount going in as being lost. And the reason for that is if you have an imbalance here, more water is being brought in that's being lost, that has to stay in the body somewhere. So here we have the urine output, lost to those insensible forms such as the skin and sweating in lungs and the feces. Right, so this would be basically a water intake in and water output. Now, we mentioned the idea of hyponatremia when we drink too much water, and that has to do with sodium. So let's talk a little bit about sodium. We've mentioned sodium previously in terms of the recommended amounts of sodium and in terms of people who have high blood pressure being on low sodium diets. Right? Sodium does have a big effect on fluid and electrolyte balance. It's associated with blood pressure because if you consume too much sodium, it can lead to high blood pressure due to there being more blood volume, more fluid component of the blood, leading to increased blood pressure. Now, sodium is necessary. We need sodium. Sodium is important for nerve impulse transmission, and then also for muscle contraction. And it's also going to be, sodium is going to be important in transporting things like glucose into cells. So this is given in grams per day. So this would be 1,500 milligrams per day. That's the requirement. So that's what we set for people who have hypertension. That would be the lowest amount taken in. Less than 2.3 grams or 2,300 milligrams per day is recommended. Now, where does sodium come from? As some of you may have noticed when you were looking at food labels much earlier, processed foods, especially things like canned soups and canned vegetables, have extremely high sodium in that. And that's because sodium is often used to stabilize foods. There's a good table to take a look at on page 240 in the textbook, table 7.2, looking at high sodium foods and then some of the lower sodium alternatives of those. Now, if you take in too much sodium, not chronically, but if you take in too much sodium, what you can get is what's called hypernatremia, and this is an abnormally high blood sodium concentration. This usually does not happen in people who are healthy. However, in people who have problems with their kidneys, The kidneys are what are able to pull out excess sodium. So in patients who have kidney problems, this can lead to big problems, especially with things like congestive heart failure. In the short term, this can also lead to things like an increase in blood volume and edema, right? Edema is swelling due to excess fluid, excess tissue fluid. High blood volume is excess blood fluid, right? And then the high blood pressure results when we increase our blood volume, it increases the pressure. Now, if you don't get enough sodium, we can get what's called hyponatremia. And hyponatremia usually does not occur. At the very beginning of the chapter, there's an overview of athletes who consume too much water and fail to replace sodium. Anyone who does endurance-type athletics cannot just consume water. They have to consume water along with some of these electrolytes. That's why there's this whole big movement about things like Gatorade and Pro-Aid and Powerade and all these different aids. And what those are, they're basically water that has had electrolytes added to them. Before all of these fancy products were available on the market, endurance athletes who sweated a lot and in sweating lost a lot of sodium and didn't just consume, they would eat salty foods, something with a little bit of sodium, as well as drinking water. The next of the important nutrients is potassium. Potassium plays a very important role in fluid and electrolyte balance. Once again, potassium is going to be important in how our nerves send signals and how our muscles contract. This is also going to be important in our acid-base balance, which has to do with the pH of our body. It's recommended to intake 4.7 or 4,700 milligrams per day. Potassium is usually found in fresh fruit, vegetables, whole grains, or where you'd find the majority of your potassium. Okay. Certain things that have a good amount of potassium would be things like raw bananas and cantaloupe. Potatoes actually are very high in potassium. So these are all food sources of potassium. This is where we get the majority of our potassium. Right. Now you can have too much potassium, but this usually only occurs in people who have kidney disease because the body can't pull the potassium out. This can then change the contraction of the heart muscle, leading to an abnormal heart rhythm. This is called hyperkalemia. There's also something called hypokalemia, which is very low blood potassium levels. Again, this is usually only seen with people who have kidney disease or people who take certain diuretic medications where they are getting rid of too much potassium in their urine because they're urinating so frequently. The next is chloride. Chloride is an important component of maintaining fluid balance. We also use chloride as part of the hydrochloric acid within the stomach, and that hydrochloric acid is important in our digestion. And chloride does have some role in the immune system. Please don't confuse chloride with chlorine. Chlorine is the elemental form, and it is actually a gas, and it's used for other purposes. Chloride is the Cl- ion, so it's very different. Most of this comes through our table salt, which is sodium chloride. The minimum recommendation is approximately 2.3 grams per day. You can consume too much chloride. Too much chloride usually occurs from taking in too much table salt. Very few people have not enough chloride in their diet. We tend to have quite a bit of chloride in our diet. Some people who have vomiting disorders can be low on chloride. The final one that we're discussed for today is phosphorus. Phosphorus, for the most part, is going to be not found in its pure form of phosphorus. Rather, it will be found as the phosphate molecule. And that phosphate molecule is going to be important in bone formation. So we'll see that later when we look at bones as well. Phosphate is also found in ATP, which is adenosine triphosphate, which is the energy that cells actually use. It's found in DNA and RNA, which make up our nucleic acids, which make up our genetics, basically. So these are all important functions of phosphorus. Okay. The phosphorus sources are found in many foods, especially those that contain proteins. There is a good amount of phosphorus in some of the amino acid groups. So we see that there is phosphorus in protein. Here are some common sources of phosphorus. So things like cheese and yogurt, lentils. Right? Again, all of these are pretty high in protein as well. All have phosphorus. Now, deficiency in phosphorus are quite rare, as I said, because it's so readily available in our diet. Too much phosphorus can occur when people take too much vitamin D supplements. Vitamin D, we're going to talk about later, are one of the fat-soluble vitamins. This can lead to different kinds of muscle spasms, convulsions, and we don't see much in the way of too little phosphorus.